right here at this event of WGEO. It's a great honor and a great opportunity for me to be able to share with you how we see that trade can be a change for force in terms of sustainability, and how trade can help to transition to clean energy. You know that this morning we launched the Baku Initiative for Climate Finance, Investment and Trade. And I would like to, for those who didn't attend or for those who didn't watch it, I want to bring two of the main messages to our discussion. And that is that trade is part of the solution for addressing climate change challenges. And trade is a force for climate action. So how can we use trade in this respect? There are some, I would like to make 4 main points. We know that we have traditional trade instruments like tariffs, non-tariff barriers, intellectual property rights, and things like that. And these traditional instruments can be used to promote clean energy. How do we do that? For example, by reducing tariffs or eliminating duties. So developing countries can have access to environmentally goods and services. Standards can also help to promote energy-efficient products, and liberalization of trade in energy-supporting services can also help developing countries to get access to competitive and state-of-the-art environmental services. A second area in which we have been working at UNCTAD has to do with how to use trade instruments and policies to accomplish the nationally determined contributions of developing countries. And let me share with you one finding that we had at UNCTAD. We mapped trade-related measures in a sample of 60 NDCs from developing countries, and we found that only 15 of those NDCs reviewed included government trade institutions in policy development. So this shows an untapped potential for climate-focused trade measures. And based on this work, we have developed a set of guides for policymakers to facilitate the integration of trade and instrument measures in NDC. And so these guides are part of the UN offering in the UNDP Climate Promise to support members as they update their NDCs towards the COP30 in Brazil next year. Now, and a third point that we want to also to bring to the discussion has to do with how we produce and how we make sure that value chains are sustainable and use clean energy to be able to address climate challenges. So at UNCTAD we have seen that trading renewable energy goods has grown. In fact, solar energy use products have increased almost 40 times, and wind 6 times between 2010 and 2022. However, this only means 5% of global energy consumption. So there's plenty of room to green or to make sustainable value chains. And to the extent that we can invest in clean energy, invest in clean production processes, developing countries will be able to participate in global value chains. And the last thing that we have seen is that in this search for reducing carbon emissions and in this search for developing clean value chains, there are new ways in which countries are introducing unilateral measures to reduce carbon emissions. This may be a well-intended goal, but the fact that we have so many unilateral measures, and this morning we were talking about 75 different carbon pricing mechanisms all over the world that don't connect. That means that we are creating a spaghetti bowl of regulations where we have no way of having a common standard. So we think that it's important that these discussions take place, and that these measures that are being adopted to address carbon emissions do not disproportionately impact developing countries. that lack resources to adopt low-emission technologies, and that also developing countries contribute very little to climate change, but should not bear the cost of having to disproportionately have the burden of adopting these new rules. So in this respect, this is where UNCTAD is coming from, and just to reiterate the message that I got this morning and that we want to reiterate from our Secretary General, Rebecca Grinspan. Trade is a force for climate action. Trade can be a very powerful source of change, and trade, without a question, can be part of a solution. Thank you.
You raised several interesting points, and I'll get back to that in a second. Your Excellency, Mr. Tattenbach, Costa Rica, beautiful country. Trade, also very important. You're in an energy transition. How do you see the developments when it comes to trade policies fostering climate adaptation and climate mitigation?
Yes, definitely. I would agree with many of the statements of my predecessor from UNCTAD, Luz Marina. I think the trade is the ultimate frontier of carbon adjustment. So it's going to be there. Whether it's unilaterally, bilaterally, multilaterally, it's going to be there. When and how regulated is important. There are steps that we're taking, for example, and I was taking note of your statements that only 13 countries have included in the NDCs trade mechanisms. Costa Rica, next one, will have trade mechanism because we have launched a trade initiative called Deforestation-Free Agribusiness Production and Agribusiness Exports. Now, it's voluntary, and it's unilateral as the EU, which is a little bit similar. I don't know if that is unilateral as well, the EU Green Deal. So not all unilaterals are the same, but okay. But having said that, we responded quickly to the. We were, I wouldn't say we were first, because that would be debatable, than the EU with this approach to zero deforestation, but we definitely are the first one to have it ready to go. And we're ready to do it. This year we will launch the product. We already have the first trade agreement with the United Arab Emirates that includes it, and the second one is being drafted now with all the new free trade agreements that Costa Rica will sign will have this policy included in trade and the whole deforestation, net zero, agricultural production differentiation of our agribusiness. Because we have invested a lot of money in this, and we find it in fair competition that our products are not valued. So it's not a matter of unilateral, it's a matter of fairness of competition when we have invested a lot in achieving zero deforestation in our landscape. We're a major agricultural producer and exporter, and the same comes with energy. Costa Rica has a completely decoupled fossil fuels from our electricity, as we have decoupled deforestation from agriculture, and it's expensive. And let's go to trade agreements. I mean, when you talk about trade agreements, you have typically you have free trade between groups of countries, nations, whatever, and then come the investment agreements, which follow, and then comes how competitive is the country, and then we come to energy. And Costa Rica is not very competitive because our cost of energy might be 2 cents or 4 cents more expensive than our competitors. Why? Because they are not renewable. They are burning fossil fuels, they're burning gas. So how does that factor in? So I think if we don't fix the trade policies, it's very hard that we can do the steps necessary to walk towards a clean world and clean energy. So I see it is unmistakable that we're going that way. How much can we do unilaterally? Well, if you go unilateral, you can do it by branding and eco-labeling and things like that. We are now a group of countries, a few groups of countries in Costa Rica, and New Zealand, and we have the list here that we have acted together to launch a small group of environmental goods the nature that you mentioned, but it has a bias for now. Because the exports, for example, driven without deforestation will have to enter as eco-labeling, and the rest is to promote goods that are supposed to be good goods. So we export of good goods with no tariffs, but the agricultural goods have been for now considered too dangerous to push for this small group. We are working on it. I'm sure we're going to get the group to agree to also agricultural, so to get the whole idea of trading and not so much, yes, these goods are good because they are renewable energy tech. And I think, I don't know, I think we are going to move to carbon border adjustment one way or another, sooner or later.
That brings me directly to the point that you were mentioning. There are so many different taxation systems of CO2 across the globe. Is that a call for more of a globally aligned CO2 taxing system, or am I now too ambitious?
Well, I think that this is an issue that we are all tackling with at UNCTAD. Yes, this is an issue that we're all tackling with. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you. No, I think this is really, I think, one of the main challenges that we have in front of us, and I do appreciate the comments by the Minister of Costa Rica. I think that he has a very good point in the sense that countries are trying to come up with the right policy mix to be able to address the challenges of sustainability, climate change, and the need to have some climate action. So, as we said, trade is a force for sustainability, is a force for change. What we're seeing also is here at COP29, we're seeing where are the discussions leading us to. We know that we need finance, we need investment, and we need trade to really work towards the sustainability that we want to accomplish, the 1.5%, that 1.5 degrees goal for 2030. We are seeing different policy instruments from different countries that are trying to address the climate change. Now, this is a global problem. Carbon emission reduction is a target for everyone, for every country, for every member state, for every person in the world, because it affects people. So what we're seeing is that right now there are different alternatives to try to tackle this. The question is, how do we make a global solution? How do we offer a global solution for a global problem? And you know that different countries have different responsibilities and also different contributions to all of this. So we need to make sure that we all have a share in the solution, but also we need to make sure that we have the technology, we have the resources, and we have the best policy mix for that to happen. So that, especially from UNCTAD perspective, developing countries are not overburdened with unnecessary measures, that the adaptation and mitigation goals are maximized and the costs are minimized.
That brings me to Ms. Novak. I'd like to get your view on the discussion. Is trade one of the important measures, and then what about things such as cross-border adjustment mechanisms, which is being implemented in the EU?
Yeah. Indeed. So we are currently Moldova since 2022. We became a candidate country to the EU. So we got into the sphere of the normative power of the EU, and the EU is a leader, global leader when it comes to climate policy. And I'm glad that also the Green Deal got mentioned there, because that's the driving narrative for us as well. Where, by the way, from a policy and regulatory perspective, we are almost implementing all the regulatory package when it comes to the clean energy package, from 2018. That means that we have on one hand targets, GHG emission binding target towards the energy community, which is a regional organization supported by the EU for countries soon to be integrated like Moldova. So we have a 68% GHG emission reduction in comparison with 1990. We're going actually quite fine in that sense. Also because Moldova, for those who don't know, does not have any fossil fuels. So we have no gas, no oil, no coal. So renewables as such, it's a no-brainer for us. It's also a way of strengthening our energy security, of being less reliant upon the external sources and gas imports as such. So when it comes to the, indeed, carbon border adjustment mechanism, because I think within the EU and also for the big exporters, global exporters of cement, steel, aluminium and so on, this was a bit of a wave shock. For us, we are also exporting steel, some cement as well. We have a separatist region in Moldova who is also heavily producing such goods and exporting them as such. And you know what? They are already preparing for that. We are also preparing for that. We understand very well that the carbon border adjustment mechanism first and foremost aims to avoid any carbon leakage. Yeah, it's a fair mechanism towards our European partners, and also most of our exports, they are with the EU. And previously it used to be with Russia, but in times of crisis you also realize who is your closer friend as well. So, as I said, we have even a decarbonization roadmap with the energy community. So what does it mean? It means that by 2030, we will have to implement our own ETS or emission trading system, or to be part of a regional ETS. Now the energy community, together with the Balkans, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, we are analyzing whether it makes sense to have a regional ETS to understand what's the impact, because also the profile of the countries are a bit, it's diverse, it's different. We are not, let's say, we do not, it depends how you look at it, because if you are to have your own ETS for a small market like ours, you would have still low liquidity in terms of emission allowances. With bigger, let's say, regional one, you would make sure that there is more trading, and then you can couple it eventually with the EU ETS in the future. So we are looking into this, but allow me to say you, because when it comes to trade, by the way, Moldova is already exporting renewable energy. Many perhaps don't know, but even to Ukraine, we are exporting wind energy, and Ukrainian generation capacity has been severely hit. More than 50% has been affected by the destructions that Russia is doing there. So we are going ahead. Ultimately, look, with CBAM, it's the following, because CBAM, it should be a tool which determines you to have your own ETS. The whole point here is actually that we need to develop our own instruments in-house that allows for that taxation, carbon taxation, to stay within your borders, so that you can eventually channel it to green technologies, and channel it, I don't know, to renovation projects. And we, by the way, energy efficiency in Moldova is the second top priority of the government.
Maybe just to get on to that point about CBAM, CBAM, what it does is it more or less ensures that the export of an ETS scheme to other countries, because it's better that the taxes collected stay in the exporting country than that they're paid at the border of Europe. But I'm also wondering, does CBAM not also do something else, and that is actually facilitate or ensure that some of the, let's say, heavy or very difficult to decarbonize industries in Europe will actually move to outside of Europe to areas where it is cheaper to decarbonize. Because when you need to decarbonize heavy industries, you typically need very low cost renewable electricity, or you need carbon capture storage opportunities. And I'm thinking those things can typically be done at a lower cost outside of Europe than in Europe. Does anyone have a view on that? That could actually lead to certain industries being moved outside of the EU? Mr. Tattenbach, your views.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed the last presentation on the topic. I think which one doesn't know how other countries are doing only renewable, and they're getting into the trading systems internally, and that's very, very interesting. Yes, I think is the question that I will pose. I don't know, not as an industrial policy. That's not my issue if the countries are losing or not. But I think, I don't know if we are capturing that in the credit creating system of Article 6 now. What happens when a sector is being decarbonized because its production is moved from a very high emitting country to a very low emitting country? Not because of costs, just emissions. Let's go with the emissions. Are we capturing that? That's not in the baseline of Costa Rica path of emissions. If we start attracting industry that is heavy in energy because we have a 100% clean energy, or Moldova that has attracting industry because it has a totally renewable energy. So that is the reaccommodation that we need. Yes, isn't that trade for? Isn't trade? I thought trade was to get the efficiency in the cost of production, and if we don't take carbon or low carbon economy as part of the efficiency, what the benefit is of trade? I mean, trade is part of this efficiency. Yes, we're being late in getting carbon there. I think that's probably yes. I mean, I would say, but what is happening is almost the opposite. With trade right now, I mean, countries who have 100% renewable energy are a little bit more expensive, the energy, if you don't take into account the cost of carbon.
Some countries actually do. If I look at Iceland has a lot of geothermal and hydro energy. They're a very cheap source, and it is zero emission. And they're actually at the moment attracting a lot of, they have aluminum smelters, they have data centers. They're attracting that, and then there's again export. But I guess your point to eventually to mitigate climate, we need to make things where they have the least CO2 impact. So it could actually foster a relocation of industries, and then hence more trade. Yeah, I see people nodding.
Well, if I just may add one point, and continuing with what the Minister of Costa Rica just mentioned. We see different carbon pricing policies coming from different countries, but we also see that what used to be a cost competitive advantage in the past is not the same today. Competitiveness is derived from different factors. Using clean energy, being sustainable is at the center of decisions of policymakers, of business, of finance. That's what we are seeing. So the market itself is telling you that if you want to remain competitive as a company, as an SME, as a sector, as a country, you need to look into those factors. In addition to that, we have domestic policies that have to do with pricing carbon emissions. So the question here is, what kind of policy mixes are countries going to have to be able to support and address climate action. So I think that we are seeing a true transformation. And this transformation goes hand in hand with many policy decisions, but also comes hand in hand with technology. The question is, who is developing that technology? Who has access to that technology? Who can finance that technology so that we can ensure that different countries in different sectors can have a share in that sustainability of production processes, which is what we're seeing.
Carolina, a lot has been said here. You mentioned thinking about ETS. What would be your competitive advantage, and do you see more trade happening other than the clean energy that you're already exporting?
So as I mentioned, by 2030 we'll have to have an ETS, emission trading system. Also, by the way, by 2030 we aim to be a EU member state. That's our internal goal, and we just had a referendum upon that. So definitely climate policy, it's going to be a sine qua non for our admission to the EU. Now, when it comes to actually having this ETS, we did an impact assessment analyzing both CBAM and ETS, and we have CHP, so combined heat and power, two state-owned enterprises who provide, even for the capital, 65% of the heating to people in Chisinau. They are being heated with CHP. They would be terribly hit with an ETS in place. And that one runs on gas. So we'll have to. I want to underline once again, before, let's not just think about the stick. Let's also think about the carrot. And by that, I mean, I recently also saw one news among the media outlets in Romania, a very clickbaity type of title, saying that soon Romanians would have to basically the gas boilers will be banned in the country. And that's true. ETS is extending in terms of buildings and transport, but that would happen roughly in 2034. And of course, this creates panic, and this creates sort of an antagonism against the ETS. And I think this has to be better and further on explained. Why? First, it's not that correct as the title says, but my point is that if we want to put forward and to have such a mechanism in place, this is very sensitive to people, and to a country which is still developing like Moldova, we will have to be extremely careful how we frame it, how do we explain it, and also the incentives that we put forward. How do we also support people to buy more heat pumps to undergo this transition? Not just punishment, because otherwise we'll have a yellow vest type of revolution, so not just in France, but also extending in other countries. We have to be extremely careful. So Just Transition Fund, explaining also the decarbonization. The issue I also see still in the country is that, yes, we have droughts, we have heavy rains, floods, and so on. Climate changes all over in the past 3 years. We see it, and also in the drop in production, agricultural production, and so on. Why people still then don't get the correlation between emissions and so affecting the cause and effect, yeah? Emissions and the floods, the climate cataclysm. We have to better explain it.
That's one of the very difficult things in society, and especially if the effects are further down.
Yeah.
I have a conundrum to the group here. For trade to flourish, there's ideally zero barriers. There's no tariffs, nothing. And then trade flows freely, and you get the production where it is most efficient. On the other hand, if we want to mitigate climate, we need to do something about CO2 emissions. So what is your view on not so much a trade tax, but something like a CO2 tax when goods are imported and exported from countries? Mr. Tatanbach.
Well, that's part of the internalization of cost. I mean, you call it tax, could be CO2 dumping if you're, but there is something else there. And I think it needs to be mentioned because you're doing it now with, I think Luz mentioned the idea of that the competitive now is different. Companies are feeling competitive and they find that a country they can produce clean energy and they do it correctly and responsible production, so-called, which is true, and that takes kind of effect to what you were saying. But what really happening? What is happening is that you're transferring the responsibility of the CO2 to the consumer instead of the producer, and the whole COP is based on producer regulate CO2, not consumer regulate production consumption.
Which I think is important because it's the consumer that typically cannot make a change, but the producer can make a change.
Well, you make your change with your pocket, with your choice. You always make the choice. You can consume, so to speak, bananas from Costa Rica, which has zero deforestation and zero carbon footprint, or you can consume it from somewhere else. We'll make sure that you know that.
I think many of the consumers don't have that type of information typically, but I think that's where policies come into play.
But if I may add, and this is following on what was said with respect to consumers, this is also changing the way producers do things. I mean, and this is something that is new to the rules in trade, because the rules that we have today in the multilateral trading system have to do specifically with the product, the kind of product, the standards are applied to the product, the tariff is applied to the product. And here we are talking about how you produce, how clean is your production process, how much emissions you are creating as a result of the product that you produce, for the repetition, but also the transportation, the logistics, the marketing. So it's a whole value chain that is being addressed from a different perspective. Not only, I completely agree with the fact that consumers are deciding what they want to buy, but producers also need to address different kinds of conditions to access the market. The problem that we need to address from a global perspective is that if we have different regulations to comply with emissions from different member states, countries, then we are somehow selecting a market, and we may be seeing that one carbon mechanism may be undermining another. So there needs to be some kind of consistency. And also there needs to be consistency among different policies regarding investment, trade, and finance to ensure that this new economy, because we're talking about new ways of producing, this new economy really responds to the needs that we are seeing today, which is that we need to reduce emissions drastically and substantively. We need to be serious about it.
Before you answer, before you come up with your point, if we want to be serious about it, and if we need to reduce drastically, does it then not just boil down to that there needs to be a price to emitting CO2? Because as long as something is for free, we'll just keep on doing it? Or do you see other ways of getting a drastic reduction in CO2 emissions without a penalty for emitting CO2?
Well, I don't think that we can only address one element, because I don't think that there's only one solution. And this is part of the discussions that we're having here at COP29, no? I mean, yes, it is reducing carbon emissions, and it is creating a sustainable economy, and it's creating a circular economy, and it is creating an economy that is addressing the scarcity of natural resources. So it's several issues that have to be taken into account. Of course, carbon emissions are at the center of the discussion, but we know that it is not the only problem, and it is not only one solution. It's not one made for all.
Yeah, I would just add that in addition to what Mrs. Contreras was mentioning, that I think you need a horizontal perspective here, and a horizontal view, and not just apply to trade as in terms of imports, exports. But recently I just realized that we don't have yet in the country, and it shocked me, but we don't have yet in the country a secondary legislation when it comes to sustainable public acquisitions. Why do we have, fossil fuel type of buses? Really, it's 2024, so maybe, and for public acquisitions, you can actually set a new trend. You can come with bolder decisions which are sustainable and clean for your population in the long run. You can set the trend. For something which is above all needed, but also that the same goes then in terms of, as you rightly mentioned, in terms of standards and having this comparative. So when we say, okay, for instance, we do have a net zero goal by 2050, what does this imply? How do you actually achieve that? Beyond the targets, beyond the immediate policies and actions you set per sector, how do you actually plan to do that, and how do you monitor and how do you review that that goal that you set for yourself? Quite often I see this discussion about new targets over and over and over, but how do you achieve the already existent ones that you have? And what's your tool to monitor that accordingly?
Mr. Tatzenbach, one more question to you. You mentioned, you hear me?
Not very well.
Okay. You mentioned Article 6 and the discussions. That's also about cross-border trade of, for instance, carbon dioxide removal certificates. Do you see a whole new world opening of CDRs being traded across borders, of carbon avoidance being traded across borders? Is that your expectation?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of a carrot approach to CO2 emissions, the trade of carbon credits. Is the carrot and stick. Taxes are the stick. Trading is the carbon are the carrots of these certificates. But the issue is whose baseline it is when you are decarbonizing a sector of the economy. Let's call it, I don't know, artificial intelligence. Let's call it microchip production. If it is shifting, from one very dirty country to another that is not that dirty in its industry, like Moldova or Costa Rica, who captures that baseline? Who produces the credit? If it is an explicit industry attraction policy, which if you have your clean energy matrix and explicit attraction of industry, we need to capture that. Is that going to be voluntary carbon market? Is it going to be here in the COP or the emissions trading system?
I think the voluntary market will have some difficulties. We need governments. I'm wondering, Mrs. de la Mora, from the United Nations perspective, you're all about international trade. What would be the one key thing for you, and also moving to the end of this panel, what would be the one or two key things for you that need to happen in the coming year, in the coming 2 years, for trade really to be a force for the good when it comes to mitigating climate?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Towards climate emission reduction, carbon emission reduction, we are seeing at UNCTAD that out of 60 mapped NDCs of developing countries, only 15 include trade ministries or trade measures. They involve trade ministries. What does that mean? There's plenty of room for countries, developing countries, to incorporate their trade ministries, their trade policies, their trade measures to be able to accomplish their NDCs. Second point that I would like to make is that we are seeing important changes in the way goods are traded as a result of new ways of producing. We need clean products. We need sustainable products. We need to change the way we produce things. We need to change those value chains. The world of trade is based on a multilateral trading system. Multilateralism is essential for trade to continue to be a force for good. In multilateralism, we all benefit. It's a win-win, and it's the only way in which we're going to be able to adapt trade rules to the challenges that climate action poses to us.
I very much agree with your points on the multilateralism. I'm afraid that the current geopolitical situation actually is diverging a bit away from that multilateralism, and we're getting more bilateral agreements or unilateral increase of tariffs.
Well, we have seen for decades the creation of regionalism, free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements. Nonetheless, the multilateral trading system has always been the underlying force. Even if multilateralism probably sometimes has it harder to move forward, multilateralism needs to be there. And I think that we are all aware that multilateralism is always a win-win.
Ms. Novak, your last point, what is it that you'd like to see happening in the coming year?
I think we need more support in terms of capacity buildings internally. So when the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Environment, we're talking about ETS, CBAM, we see the same alignment from the Ministry of Economy and the other line ministry, also Ministry of Finance, by the way, which plays a crucial role. So I very much agree with Mrs. De La Mora. So we need to extend. So the two elements. One is within the government to make sure that this driving force for net zero by 2050 is well understood by everyone, and it's well understood in terms of key specific actions, what needs to be done. And here is also a matter of training. It's also spreading the knowledge. It's also most of them, they don't even understand very well what actually even this CBAM will imply. So we are still at that level of understanding, waking up and preparing accordingly, so that also our economy is not affected in that sense, that we're getting ready for any shock absorption. And secondly, I would say, and I very much agree with your point here in terms of multilateralism. My country is a small one, although our ambition is beyond, I would say. We are quite steadfast when it comes to net zero, to renewables as well. Right now, we doubled our renewables capacity within 1 year. And maintaining this regional cooperation, making sure, because ultimately trade, you're doing trade primarily with your neighbors. It's not just a one-side approach. It's a lot about cooperation, collaboration. So, yeah, I think this is the perfect forum to reflect upon these issues. Thank you.
Mr. Tattenbach, your final comment. What would you like to see in the coming year to foster trade as a force for the good to mitigate climate change?
Well, I think it is necessary to get a carbon thoughtful trade. No doubt about it. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to evolve without taking into account the embedded carbon in the products that we consume. And there's going to be a shift towards consumption responsibility, which is assumed once you put it in the product. When you bring the thing to the product, and you're talking about the embedded product, which is what trade is all about, because it goes to the end. At that moment, you are shifting to the consumer. And maybe it's going to be easier and less yellow vests or whatever. Yeah. But trade is a force for good in this climate change, and multilateralism is good too.
Thank you very much. We've seen over the last decades that trade has brought us great wealth and has enabled many people to move out of poverty. It has made our societies, and I'm quite convinced that also trade will help, and trade is absolutely necessary to efficiently and effectively mitigate climate change. Thank you very much for your time.